and live from Madrid and Oxford, it's ZN Live. That's right. There you go. And this is not an effect because I am sitting with Justin in Madrid. And today we have a very special guest all the way from Oxford. That is Remco Timmermans. Remco is a space influencer. He's been talking a lot on critical issues, and he's actually an expert at communication, also the CEO of Spaceside and an educator in the space area. And basically, he's been looking at ways to engage with people. And I want to start with a specific question from you to you, Remco, which is, space is a very complicated area to communicate on. There are lots of things happening. Often the public doesn't really understand what is. So how do you approach communication on such a topic, and what really works for you?
Often the public really doesn't understand. I mean, that's the crux of it all. And that is the difficulty with an industry that is misunderstood, as you say, but also complicated. And at the same time, it's growing very fast. It's upcoming. We are talking about the next $1 trillion industry, either by 2030 or 2040, depending on who you believe. But this is up and coming. But as you say, it is a complicated industry. And I talk about this a lot. The thing is, space inspires a lot of people. When you ask 6, 7-year-old kids, what do you want to be? There's always a list of 5 or 6 things, and astronaut is always one of them. Policeman, fireman, doctor, lawyer, whatever, an astronaut. And that is based to a certain extent on a misunderstanding of what the space industry is all about right now. As we all know, the space race happened in the 1950s, 60s, kind of culminated in the 1970s with Neil Armstrong stepping foot on the moon. And that's where the story of space ends. And this is something I often say in keynotes about the communication of space as an industry, is the story of space ended in July 1969, when our friends Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped on the moon. That was the end of it. As you know, the last 3 Apollo missions got cancelled because after Apollo 11, people stopped caring. And the image that the space industry has is stuck in the 1960s and 1970s. Yes, there were a few highlights, and we had 135 space shuttle missions that barely anyone knows about or cares about. We have several space stations in orbit right now. We have an enormous proliferation of satellites circling our planet, which is causing all kinds of problems. And we're getting lots of benefits. We have Earth observation. We have satellite navigation that is unmissable in modern society. We have telecommunication. Yet the real story of what the space industry is like, nobody knows about. And, people go to high street clothes stores to buy all these NASA logo shirts. Everybody wears NASA logos, yet nobody understands what's behind it. And that is the big challenge of communicators in space, like myself, is to tell people what happened in the last 50 years since Neil Armstrong stepped foot on the moon, or longer even by now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting challenge. And I think, that kind of brings to mind that a lot of the conversation around space recently has been driven by Elon Musk and SpaceX, bringing kind of a lot of this back to the fore. And I would say that's probably the Elon Musk who is the, pre-Twitter Elon Musk, where he used to be an innovator and all that. And now he's kind of the slightly eccentric and slightly insane person tweeting things that are unpredictable. I think there'll be a kind of post-Twitter acquisition Musk and a pre-Twitter acquisition Musk. So what do you think he's done to bring the story of space there? And I want to come next to the channel, the using X to tell that story. But do you think he's a very important factor in bringing that conversation to the public?
An important factor for sure. For all the reasons that you just mentioned. I mean, you called him all kinds of different characteristics. He's a very controversial figure. Is he insane? Well, no. Is he a genius? No. He's a bit of both in a way. And he does a lot of good stuff, and he does a lot of maybe not so good stuff, in the sense that he doesn't paint a realistic picture of what the space industry is about. What he does, maybe Jeff Bezos does as well, and some of the other billionaires that are part of the space sector, is they are now turning space into a billionaire's playground. That's a word that we hear a lot in the space industry as sort of a way to describe what the space industry might be about, and that's also not right. Yes, it is. Much of the stuff that is out there, that is part of what people see of space, is billionaires' play. But there's a lot happening in the background that kind of gets overshadowed by all this. So SpaceX, Elon Musk, is the new NASA, if you like. But of course it isn't. Elon Musk he's taking a lot of risk, and he did an amazing thing. Well, his team, I should say, because he has an amazing team behind him at SpaceX and at Tesla, and hopefully at some point at X as well. But at least at SpaceX, he has an amazing team of the best rocket scientists, literally, in the world. And that is something that we have to credit Elon Musk for, is he is able to gather amazing people around him. He's able to pay them, but most of all, he's able to find them, and he's able to keep them. So if we look at SpaceX, is a typical example of, yes, Elon Musk is the chief engineer. He's the Sergei Korolev or the Werner von Braun of the modern space era, and what he did with reusable launches is absolutely amazing, and it caused a big revolution in getting the price of access to space down considerably, and setting the bar really high for all the competition. But it's not just him, and he's very good at marketing. This is what we have to credit mostly American companies for. Americans are amazing at storytelling, and Americans are amazing at allocating budget to storytelling, because that's something that is often missing in other geographies, including Europe. Europe plays an important role in space, yet nobody really knows about that, and that's because we're not used to allocating budget. That's a story we may come back to later. But US space companies do that, and they know why it is relevant. SpaceX even hired the narrator that did all the NASA launches, that worked for NASA previously. He's the voice of space, if you like. He's been for many years. He's now working for SpaceX to continue that NASA look and feel of what SpaceX is doing. And he's doing an amazing job, causing a breakthrough. And I must say, SpaceX is probably one of the better examples of how Musk is revolutionizing the world. SpaceX and Tesla. What he's doing with his other companies is maybe a little bit more iffy, but SpaceX and Tesla are definitely setting new bars for society, which is good. But as I say, it overshadows all the other good stuff that is happening, and especially here in the European Union.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you emphasize the importance of storytelling. And also we have a question, by the way, from Daniel, who's in Brussels, and who's saying, as it happens, the space race, we're now in the middle of an AI race. Interesting outcomes, and we'll come on the question of AI and what role it plays in communication. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Justin, who's often behind the scenes and asking very good questions, is here with me. Actually, you can see he's just physically next to me, but we've got two laptops so that we don't have too much sound conflict. And I want to go back to your question about communication. We talked about the importance of having a narrative. And then, of course, there's a question of where do you have that? Where do you tell that story? There's been a lot of discussions. We talked about it during the EU influencer event, and you are a very active and very effective communicator on space. Actually, you're doing some great work, some videos from different places, narrating that story. Now, there's a practical question a lot of communicators ask, which is about X. You are still on X. What are your thoughts about the kind of big changes around social media? Are you also looking at LinkedIn? I see that you're posting there as well. What's your view on where people should focus and their feelings about Twitter X?
Yeah, there's a few angles to that. Where people should focus is obviously a personal choice, is wherever you feel most comfortable. And in my case, as a professional communicator, is where is my audience? And my audience is very clearly within the space bubble. I mean, we talk about the Brussels bubble a lot, but of course, space is a tiny industry compared to many other industries. And we talk constantly about the space bubble. And my audience is safely within that space bubble, even though the biggest challenge is to break outside. Because again, who needs to preach to the choir, and I'm afraid I do that a lot. But I provide information that is relevant to space professionals. That is kind of the niche that I selected, and that really drives me to channels. Is where is my audience? And my audience, very clearly, the space industry is very loyal to Twitter, or X now. Is that due to Elon Musk? I mean, within the space industry, we have lots of Elon groupies, I would call them, that follow every screw that is screwed into the new rockets in Texas, very, very loyally. But also the more serious stories of space are happening on X, and they continue to happen on X. And yes, we've seen people venture out to Threads and to Blue Sky and to Mastodon, but the core really remained on X until those other channels provide a critical mass, if you like, as far as audience is concerned. I experiment on most of those. I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on Threads, but I'm not finding my my audience there. Having said that, it has dropped a little bit over the last, I'd say, year, but still the critical mass is there. But much of the critical mass in the industry has moved to LinkedIn. LinkedIn is very quickly, and I know you see that trend as well, but LinkedIn is becoming a powerhouse in the space industry. And of course, it's a powerhouse in most industries, as we all know, also in Brussels. But LinkedIn is definitely something that's been up and coming in the last year. If we then look at other channels like Instagram, well, Instagram, to my personal opinion, is not the best for B2B. And of course, my communication is mostly B2B. Space is a business. I don't really talk a lot to space enthusiasts, although I do have a lot in my following. So thank you for joining all. But my story is about what is the industry like from a professional point of view, and that is really that discussion is driven on Twitter and LinkedIn most of all.
Okay, Remco, could you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. I've got a question because I'm from Asia, and I'd like to ask because I see a lot of space communication on X and more on LinkedIn. I see a lot of it from people working on SpaceX in SpaceX in NASA and in the EU specifically. But are there a lot of space communicators outside of those geographies, if you will, like? And if so, like, are communicators within the EU collaborate with them, communicate with them, like engage in dialogue with them?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's good that you say so, because space has always been a very global endeavor. I mean, yes, driven by, especially the whole storytelling driven by the US and to a lesser extent in Europe, but we see an evolution, quite a fast evolution in the industry, which is globalizing very fast. It's no longer just the US, Europe, maybe the Soviet Union, well, or Russia, but the role of Russia, for obvious reasons, is kind of disappeared for now. We see new space nations up and coming. Most visibly, India. India landed for the first time on the South Pole of the Moon, or near the South Pole of the Moon. What an amazing achievement for $30 million. Imagine that. A budget of 30 million to put a lander successfully on the moon. And we've seen many commercial companies that spend a lot more in the last months failing to do so. We've seen China to put a rover on the far side of the moon just 2 years ago. So these are new nations. And it's not just those big nations. I mean, big nations with a big budget. It's also smaller countries. And I talk a lot about this. And this is something that is important also when you look at, for example, the membership of the International Astronautical Federation. It's a federation that gathers all space organizations, space companies in sort of an industry association, if you like. And we see a lot of attention to membership and to developments in countries that are not so obvious. And I often talk about countries like Costa Rica, countries like Mauritius. I was in the Maldives last year for a space conference. Imagine that. We see, especially in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, we see new space agencies being formed by governments, or new NGOs, research organizations being formed to benefit from what's going on in space in even the most less at least in the least obvious countries, if you like. I mean, in Europe, we have a country like Luxembourg that over the last 5-6 years took a very important position in the European space industry. Who would have thought Luxembourg, one of the smallest countries in Europe, is now one of the major players in what we call new space, in the commercial space sector. So we see a globalization, and that trend is global. It's not just in Europe and North America. It is definitely in Asia. It's definitely even in places like South America. I was in Ecuador just 2 years ago for a space conference that talked about new developing space nations and how can we, as an established industry here in the West, in Europe and in North America, support that development. And the Artemis Accords that you may have heard of is a United States NASA initiative to have bilateral agreements with countries all over the world to go back to the moon together. Artemis is about going back to the moon, and there's now over 30 signees, including many countries outside of the usual suspects. Iceland was one of the last signatories of the Artemis Accords. Who would have thought Iceland going to the moon? I mean, they have plenty of stuff that looks like the moon themselves, but they're now a signatory of the Artemis Accord. So yes, it's a really relevant question in the space industry right now. So that was a long answer, but an important one. Thank you, Justin, for asking.
No, I think it's a very good point, and basically looking at space from different perspectives is really key, and not have this kind of US, EU centric approach, but really seeing it as a global endeavor. And I think you mentioned India. I think the way they innovate with what they call the Jugaad spirit, which is looking at things from a low cost perspective, saying how can we create things from first principles. In fact, they take Elon Musk's concept much further and say, look, let's just build from where we can. And I think a lot of incredible innovation is happening. And to come back to what you said earlier, I think what the space industry needs most is innovation and communication. And I think this applies in particular to Europe, which is doing some incredible work in space. I think people like how much of research, how much investment, how much innovation is happening. And I want to come to the importance of innovation and communication. As you know, USPA has been doing some very interesting things, trying new ways to engage with the ecosystem and with the public at large. What are your thoughts on how Europe is innovating in communication and what they can do? There's been a VR AR initiative that I know that you had a look at. So what are your thoughts on what's happening and where it's going?
Yeah, first of all, the role of Europe in space is often relatively invisible, relatively underestimated by people. I mean, Europe has the biggest Earth observation constellation, the Copernicus program by the European Commission. We have the most accurate satellite navigation system. It's not GPS. People stop calling it GPS because GPS is only one of 5 or 6 systems. The European system, Galileo, is the most accurate, and we all use it. All our cell phones have satellite navigation chips in them that work with all these different systems, not just the US GPS, but also European Galileo. We're working on Europe's independent government secure satellite communication system called GovSatcom. And these are all initiatives by the European Commission that is investing billions in this because they see the relevance to society, the benefits to society of all these programs. What's missing is the communication part. So the innovation part, the European Commission and the European Union is very good at that. So money is there, money is available also to entrepreneurs. I should mention the Cassini program, again driven by USPA. That is an entrepreneurship program for innovators in space, for startups, for SMEs, for smaller companies to come up with innovative solutions that make use of this massive amount of Earth observation data, this innovative satellite navigation technology, secure satellite communication, but also things like space situational awareness. That's the newest initiative by USPA, where we talk about preventing asteroid impacts. Have you all seen Don't Look Up, that film? Look at it. The European Commission is working on that. We talk about space debris mitigation. Again, things that you may not hear of a lot, but is really important in the industry. We talk about space weather, the risk of solar flares to our society. The European Commission, through USPA, is working on all of these. But one of the key problems there is that this is not known by enough people. Within the space bubble, we know all about this, and we talk about it like it is common knowledge, but it really isn't. The biggest challenge, in my opinion, for the European Union and for all these organizations involved in all these programs, including USPA, is how do you communicate that outside of the space bubble and outside of the Brussels bubble who is involved in all that stuff. We still need more people to use this wealth of Earth observation data or come up with new innovations using satellite navigation, because these things are driving society as we know it, but are also driving our efforts to counter climate change and all the big questions that we have. So
Yeah, no, I think
communication is key.
Yeah, I think you're right. And by the way, Daniel said that you have very cool space rockets behind you. So absolutely true. Part of our communication efforts is to show people what it's all about. But you're absolutely right. Being able to tell a story is a huge part of what allows you to do those things. And you just highlighted a series of very interesting, very important initiatives that the public is often unaware of because there hasn't been enough kind of real communication, and I think that's the innovation that might be missing is innovation in communication, trying new channels, using virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence to start telling stories. And now the tools are becoming more and more interesting. Now they are coming online right now, so they're quite new. So are you optimistic that the tools are going to help the story being told, or do you think there's a need for kind of more maybe risk-taking and ambitious approaches to communication to get the message to the public?
Yes, I think a little bit of all of it. The key issue to me is not so much in the availability of tools, because space in that sense is no different from any other industry. The tools for marketeers, for communicators, they're all there. They're not specific to an industry, so we can use those tools. The challenge in the space industry, which is a highly tech-driven industry, the space industry, let's face it, is driven by engineers and scientists, and not necessarily yet by marketeers and communicators. And that's where the problem is it's not in the tools, it's in the operators. And space organizations and space companies have been so focused on developing the most amazing technology out there that they forget, or they are unaware, because they're so focused on technology, that communication is such an important part of telling your story, of getting the message out there. There's still too many people out there in the space industry who think that cool products and cool stuff will sell themselves and the stories will spread automatically. And we all know that that's not the case. The reason why the moon landings were such a communication success and a PR success is because there was a massive budget. They had knowledgeable operators who drove those campaigns. And that is what's missing in the industry. So people who know how to operate those communication tools, that is missing. And for that to happen, industry players, it sounds really, really blunt, need to realize that they need to allocate budget for that. Because as much as you need specialists to build rockets and satellites, you need specialists to communicate the story. And storytelling is a skill. It's not something that everybody can do. It's something that you have to be trained for. And you have to bring in those trained communicators to tell your story in a professional and especially effective way. And that is what's lacking in a highly tech industry as the space sector, in my opinion. Some companies are better at it than others, but in Europe especially, we see a lack of professional communication in these companies, leading to, well, what we're now seeing is that the story is largely unknown.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And, it's something we often tell our clients is that if you have a great story, but it's not being told, it doesn't reach its audience. So really learning how to do that. And I think what you just told us is a call to action to bring in more communication talent in the industry, because it's almost like, the missing part of the equation. Once we have that, then you can actually multiply the impact of what you're doing. So thank you very much for that. I think that's very important. So now we're going to move to the recommendations. So Remco, what are your recommendations to watch, listen to for our audience?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's a new podcast that is specifically for communication in the space industry by the Space Communications Alliance. It's 20 minutes about space communication of PR. Yeah, here it says the real name: 20 minutes of marketing and PR insights by the Space Communications Alliance. That's a new podcast. I was honored to do the very first episode, and a few episodes are out there, but we will have monthly episodes that highlight different elements of exactly what we were talking about. Is how can you, as a space organization or space company, benefit from all those tools out there, and what specialists do you need to bring in-house to benefit mostly from those tools? So listen to that one. It's brand new. We're kind of building up an audience, but that's the idea. And then there's a few recommendations on accounts, especially on Twitter, that I think are worthwhile, that are doing great work that is maybe not seen by enough people. And the first one is Copernicus. I told about the biggest Earth observation system, constellation, whatever you want to call it, program in the world. Is called Copernicus, and Copernicus consists of a number of satellites that are circling our planet every day, and that bring 30 terabytes of data down every day about the health of our planet. And what the Copernicus EU account does, the people behind the account, they are the professional communicators that we've been talking about. They're really good, and they link this massive amount of data to relevant events that are happening in the news, in sports, special days. You'll see stuff around the elections, for example. Lots of stuff that bring something really abstract like Earth observation to relevant events that matter to people. And that, in essence, is good storytelling, is how do you make it relevant to your audience? And Copernicus EU is one of those accounts that does that really well. Copernicus is one of the programs by EUSPA, the European Union Agency for the Space Program. The acronym doesn't work, but EUSPA sounds better. And their account on X, EU4, number 4, space, is worth following because it tells you everything about what's going on in Copernicus, in Galileo, in GovSatcom, in space situational awareness, and it tells you about the events that are taking place in Europe that are interesting in that regard. They also talk a lot, and that is relevant, and one of the reasons I want to mention it, for the entrepreneurship program, for the Cassini entrepreneurship program, which has over €1 billion in it for people who come up with innovative ideas to use this data. So any company, be it data analytics, be it in cities, in forestry, in agriculture, in all the application areas of space data, there's a lot of money available for innovative ideas, for entrepreneurs, for small companies in Europe to pick up that data and do something with it, to build applications, to merge it with other data into new and innovative tools. So follow EU for space for that. And then lastly, there's, or not lastly, but I have two more. One is to de-emphasize the role of the US a little bit. There's a lot of information and good communication coming from the US, Space News, space.com. There's all sorts of very good websites. But in Europe, we have SpaceWatch Global. Now, it says global, but this is based in Europe, and SpaceWatch Global focuses on non-US news. As I said, there's enough news coming from the US. Whatever's happening, not in the US, in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, in South America and Africa. You can follow that on SpaceWatch Global. And then there's a myriad of really good science communicators who focus on space. And the one that I want to give a little shout out to is John Chase, Ort Kuiper, a really crazy name on Twitter. But he is a science communicator, not necessarily specific in space, but I met him last Friday at an event, and that's why he popped up. And he's a rapper as well as a science communicator. He raps about space. It is amazing. He knows a lot about the history of science and science communication, and he uses these very creative ways to tell stories through music, through rap, that brings those stories to completely new audiences. And I think that is something that we can all learn something about, is use these creative new channels like singing, like what Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut, did with his guitar on board the ISS a few years ago, and he became a massive hit on YouTube, 20 million hits within a few days, just by floating upside down in the space station singing a David Bowie song. Those are examples of creative ways to bring the message of science, or space in my case, to new audiences, and that is what we can take examples of. So far, my recommendations. There's dozens more, and I don't do credit to most people, but these are just a few that I wanted to highlight.
Fantastic, and we're going to post all of this in our summary article. This comes out next week, and we're going to keep talking about this. So it's great to have your input, and I can't wait to hear your joint rap with to see how you can take this whole conversation to the next level. I want to give a quick. I want to give a quick shout out to Beer and Politics. There's an event taking place next week, which is a very nice way to have conversations around about politics around beer. And we also have a lot of work from Tom Moylan, Restless Brussels, which is something very interesting that talks about democracy and how people should get involved in the upcoming election if you live in Brussels and you're part of the international community. My recommendation this week is actually The Diary of a CEO, which is also the name of a podcast, but it's a book by Stephen Bartlett. And it's really about what are the key principles that he applies in his life to build the business he did and what he derived from it. It's a nicely designed book. It's got some key principles, some ideas of how to set priorities, how to follow through, things that you probably hear in different spaces brought together in a quite elegant way. If you listen to his podcast, you will enjoy this. So that's all we have time for today. So from Madrid and from Oxford, goodbye, have a fantastic weekend, and see you online. Bye, everyone.